Let's see if we can do this without a microphone. You think it'll work?
No.
If there's a problem with that, you let me know. My name is Loren Spivack, and I go by the nickname the Free Market Warrior because I travel all over the United States, from Maine to San Diego, and I talk to Republican groups and conservative groups and Tea Party groups about free market economics. It is my contention that the greatest problems facing our country today stem from our utter failure as a nation to understand even the most basic principles of economics. Something made us the wealthiest country in the history of planet Earth. I could even put a date on it. It was 1885 when we passed Britain and became the biggest economy in the world. And we kept that title for 129 years until last year when China became the greatest economy in the world. Well, now we're the most indebted country in the world, in the history of the world. Well, how does stuff like that happen? Is this just like the weather? Is this just dumb luck? It just happens and there's nothing you can do about it? Or could it have something to do with the fact that we had one set of economic policies back when we were getting richer and richer and richer, and then we switched to the exact opposite economic policies, and we've been getting poorer and poorer and poorer ever since then? I think that might have something to do with it. So my mission is to try to get people to understand the basic facts of life of economics. Very, very few Americans do. Very few members of Congress do. I would be hard-pressed to name 5 members of Congress out of 535 who could even explain to you how a free market economy works, let alone, be in favor of it. So anyhow, about 5 years ago, I put together a seminar called Economic Literacy. It is a 2-night, 7-hour seminar designed for conservatives who really want to have the facts of life about economics, how economies work, and then in the second half, we apply them to various issues facing our country today. And I've done this seminar about 300 times now in 22 states, a couple dozen times in California alone, and we were just talking about this outside. I think I've done it 6 times in Orange County alone, but not with you guys. So my first message to you tonight is, if you like, I would love to come back and do the whole seminar. I will be back in late August through September. And you got to give me 2 nights. I don't charge. It's a college degree in economics, $200,000 cheaper. Okay, and free market oriented, which is harder and harder to get in an American college. So anyhow, just put that offer on the table. What I was going to do in our more limited time tonight is I was going to talk about a little piece of economics, like a little corner of economics. I was going to talk a little bit about money, because everybody talks about money. A lot of people misunderstand money. People confuse money with wealth. They seem to be the same thing, don't they? How do you know if you're wealthy? You got a big pile of money. So money must be wealth and wealth must be money. But it's not true. It is a freshman economics student's error to confuse money with wealth. You know what money really is? It's a tool we use to measure wealth. It's not wealth. It's a tool that measures wealth, right? Like a clock measures time. Is a clock the same thing as time? Are those words synonymous, clock and time? No. If I bend back the arm of the clock, do I give myself more time? I break the clock. If I leave the clock alone, it measures time. If I mess with it, it doesn't do anything at all. And that's kind of where we are with money. So why should you care about all of this? Well, it's very relevant because for about 80 years now, the official economic policy of the United States government has been based on the writings of an economic quack named John Maynard Keynes, who back in the 30s said that the government could fix a recession. How? By throwing money around. And we've been following his advice ever since then. And if you look closely, he's making that same freshman mistake. He's confusing the money with the prosperity, with the wealth. And so I wanted to talk tonight about Keynes and his ideas. Not because he's right. He's probably one of the wrongest people in the history of economics. He's got ideas that have never, ever, ever worked. Not once. But you need to know them. You need to be familiar with this because our country is being run on the assumption that he is right. That's why you need to know this. Okay, this is not like you're not knowing it's protecting you from it. It's not. So my first question for Keynes was a very simple one. Where does the government get the money from that it's going to use to stimulate the economy? Governments only get money three ways. They can tax it, they can borrow it, they can print it. If you know of any others, tell me afterwards, okay? I only know those three. And if we go through these, let's start with the taxation. If the government taxes your money away from you and then gives it back to you, are you stimulated? And certainly not. We could have just left you alone. What was that whole exercise about? And in fairness, that's not what Keynes says. Keynes does not say to raise taxes. He actually says to cut taxes. This is where it gets kind of funny because his followers today have largely forgotten this point. They remember everything else. The cutting taxes part, you don't hear very much. But Keynes says, cut taxes, lower taxes, and at the same time, increase spending. He says spend more, tax less, because the secret to prosperity, says John Maynard Keynes, the official economist of the United States government, he says the secret to prosperity is deficits. He says deficits are good, deficits are the road to prosperity, and bigger deficits are better than smaller deficits. Now, you may recall that back in 2009, when Obama was first elected, he launched $1 trillion stimulus to stimulate the American economy. You remember that? And it achieved what economists call a dead cat bounce. You know what that is? That's when you throw a dead cat on the ground and see how high it bounces. Okay? Obama said if we don't pass this stimulus, unemployment could reach 8%. So they passed it, and it reached 9.5%. And so last year on Fox News, they were observing the 5th anniversary of the Obama stimulus. And they had on the obligatory conservative commentator and the obligatory liberal commentator. And what does the liberal lady say? Because we were talking about why it didn't work. What do you think she said? She said it wasn't big enough. That's why it didn't work. It wasn't big enough. And it triggered a memory for me because when I was in college, we were learning about the Great Depression and Roosevelt and the New Deal, and he had all of these programs, and they didn't work. You know that, right? They did not work. After 6 years of Roosevelt and the New Deal, about where we are now with Obama, after 6 years, do you know what the unemployment rate was? 18%. Not 8%, 18%, and rising. It wasn't going down, it was going up. And I said to my professor, how come all this stuff Roosevelt did, it didn't work? And you know what he said? He said it wasn't big enough. It's a nice trick. It never works. It's never big enough, okay? They got their rhetoric down pat, okay? The economics may be wrong. Their rhetoric is perfect. And so what Keynes says is that you can stimulate an economy with borrowed money because we can raise the pond by filling it with water that we borrow. We're not taking it out like taxation. We're just putting it in. But of course, that's not true. Because where do you borrow it from? The planet Neptune? You're borrowing it from the economy. Where else? Every dollar borrowed must be lent. Must it not? Dollars borrowed, dollars lent. Do you think there's any difference between the two numbers? The reason that borrowing and lending exist in the world is very simple. There are some people on Earth who have more money than they want to spend right now. There's other people who want to spend money right now they don't have. So you know what happens? Catch this. The guy who wants to spend money he doesn't have goes to the guy who has money he doesn't want to spend and borrows it. Usually there's a bank in the middle. But the bank's just a broker. The bank's a middleman. The guy who wants to spend money he doesn't have is borrowing it from the guy who has money he doesn't want to spend every single time. Could it be otherwise? And if the government borrows the money, there's obviously less money for everybody else to borrow. So you are taking it out of the economy. You're just taking it out of the credit system instead of out of the tax system. But you're taking it out of the common. So now we're taking buckets of water from one side of the pond to put them in the other side of the pond, and we're still trying to raise the pond. But Keynes disagrees with me. He says, no, deficits are good. Debt's what's going to lead us to prosperity. So the third thing you can do is print the money. And print it we do. If you're one of those people who's worried that we're borrowing our deficit from China, stop worrying. We haven't borrowed a penny from China for years and years now. We are printing the entire federal deficit, about $1 trillion a year. And we've been doing it for years and years. It's brand new printed money. And what's wrong with that? Well, the problem is you devalue the money you've already got. Again, how could it be otherwise? How could you make more of anything and not reduce its value? I have had people who have said to me, no, you can just print money in Washington and it won't hurt the value of money. If that's true, then why do we do anything else? Why do we waste our time? Why do we have a tax at all? We should get rid of the income tax and print the entire federal budget if it doesn't make any difference. Okay, why go through the trouble of having all those 1040 forms all every April? So anyhow, so that's what you do. And when I do my seminar, I didn't bring it with me today. When I do my seminar, I usually bring with me one of my most prized possessions, because I am the proud owner of a $100 trillion bill. And it's real. It's not fake. It's not counterfeit. It's not a toy. It is a genuine, real currency, real 100 trillion with a T dollar bill from Zimbabwe, where 100 trillion Zimbabwe dollars will buy you a 12-ounce Pepsi. That's what you feed into the soda machine to get your soda in Zimbabwe is 100 trillion. And people say that's crazy. Whose idea was that? 100 trillion to a Pepsi? Well, nobody decided that per se, but the government of Zimbabwe for years and years practiced an economic policy very much like the one we're practicing now. They would run out of money, they printed more. And they made some important discoveries. I call this the Zimbabwe School of Economics. They discovered that it costs no more to print a $100 trillion bill than it costs to print a $1 bill. Did you know that? The zeros are free. The printers just throw those in for free. So the government of Zimbabwe would call up the print shop and say, we need another tractor trailer truck full of money, only this time stick 3 more zeros on the end of everything and ship it on down here because we're fresh out of money again. You keep doing that, it's 100 trillion to a Pepsi. That's where you're heading. Now, I'll tell you, in the 1960s, which was not that long ago, I was born in the 1960s, the Zimbabwe dollar was actually worth slightly more than the US dollar. It was worth about $1.10. Now it's 100 trillion to 1. Okay, who did that? The printers of Zimbabwe did that. That's how you make that happen. So you may recall, I'm thinking it was about 2 years ago, the government of Cyprus announced that they were going to confiscate 10% of every bank account in Cyprus. Do you remember that news story? That was like the talk of the town for a little while back, 2 years ago. And I remember it really well because I speak to groups about economics all the time. And for a month straight, every talk I gave, we would go to the question and answer period. And the first question for a month was, will the United States government be doing that to us? Is the US government going to be confiscating 10% of my bank account? It's a great question with a really, really important answer. And the answer is no. The US government will not be confiscating 10% of your bank account. I guarantee it. For one very simple, important reason. They don't have to. They've got a much easier way of achieving the exact same result. They can print their own money limitlessly. And when they do that, they take the value out of your money without taking your money out of the bank. That's way easier. Just to put this in, I want to make sure you understand this. I'm going to put this in personal terms for you. Let's imagine that you owned your own printing press in your own basement where you could print money limitlessly. Okay, you with me on this? Now here's the question. Under these conditions, would you rob a bank? Certainly not. Robbing a bank is dangerous. You could get shot. You could get arrested. You could spend 20 years in the penitentiary. Why would you risk all of that when you could just peacefully print money in your basement? Well, now you know how the United States government feels. That's exactly how they feel. Why go through the political hassles of confiscating people's money when we can just silently and day after day take the value out of the money and leave the money in the bank? I don't know how many of you have saved up 100 trillion yet, for retirement. But let's say you have, you work hard, you got $100 trillion saved up in your savings account, and you go to withdraw it, and you find out that it's enough to buy a Pepsi. You're going to feel like you've been robbed. And the bank's going to say, what are you talking about? It's every penny. You count it again. Every penny is right there. And it is. The money is there. The value is gone. That's the issue with that. But again, Keynes disagrees with me. He says, no, he says inflation is good, printing money is good, borrowing is good, it'll all get us to prosperity. So I want to go a notch deeper into Keynes's idea, because again, this is important that we understand this. I hear this all the time, by the way, his ideas. I hear them on Fox News all the time. I cannot watch Fox News for 2 hours without hearing Keynesian ideas, which are utter nonsense, coming out. And they're the good guys, okay, Fox News. And so here's what he says. He says, this is what causes a recession, according to Keynes. He says there's too much supply and not enough demand. Too much stuff out there, not enough people buying the stuff. So what happens? Well, the factories lay off workers. They don't need workers. There's too much stuff. Why would I pay you to make more stuff if I can't sell the stuff we made last week? So workers go home. And now the workers don't have paychecks. What happens to demand? Demand falls further because the workers don't have any money, they can't afford anything. So you've got too much supply, not enough demand, and the demand is falling. Keynes says you're in a trap. How do we get out of this trap? Now, you might say, well, if the workers got their old job back at the factory and the wheels would start turning and eventually the whole economy would come to life. But Keynes says no. He says that's not the answer. He says, sure, if the workers got their old jobs back, demand would rise because they've got paychecks and money to spend. Demand would rise, but so would supply, because now they're producing stuff. If supply and demand are out of whack, this is a very important Keynesian point. He says if supply and demand are out of whack, and you raise them both, they're still out of whack. No, 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 says Keynes. He says, we got to get these workers jobs where they earn money and have money to spend, but where they produce nothing. And I was like, where do you find a job like that? Who's gonna pay you to produce nothing? And I can hear that some of you have read Keynes's book, because that's exactly what he says. He says the government will pay them to produce nothing, and then there'll be more demand and not more supply, and we are on the road to prosperity. Understand that efficiency has nothing to do with this, because the whole point's to produce nothing. So if the government hires you to dig a hole in the ground and then fill the hole back in with the same dirt, perfect job, says Keynes. You're doing nothing, you're making money, we're on the road to prosperity. So, okay, so to make sure we got this here. Inflation is good, debt is good, waste is good. We've had 14 presidents, from Herbert Hoover to Barack Obama. How many of those 14 do you think believed in this concept that I'm relating to, which we call Keynesian economics? I count 13 out of 14. We have had one non-Keynesian president in the last 80 years. In your entire life, we've had one who was not, everyone else believed in this. Okay, so I saved the best for last, though. What else does Keynes recommend for us? Destruction. He says destruction is very, very good, because if you've got too much supply and not enough demand, If you destroy the supply, you won't have too much supply anymore, will you? How many of you were taught, as I was taught, that World War II was good for the economy? Yeah, all that destruction. Keynes loves wars. His wars are the best because soldiers don't produce consumer goods. They shoot bullets at each other, but they get paid. And so there's demand without supply, and as an added bonus, they blow stuff up, which then has to be rebuilt. And so that really stimulates the economy. This is what he says. Read his book. And by the way, Keynes has had the government do this in all kinds of ways. Do you remember cash for clunkers? What was that? You destroy your car so we can build a new car. This is exactly Keynesian thinking. During the Great Depression, the U.S. government took 8 million hogs, nothing wrong with them, perfectly good, slaughtered them all, dug a big pit, and just buried them. Yeah, people were starving. My mother grew up in the Great Depression. She had 1 bowl of cabbage soup a day for 2 years because that's all her family could afford. While the U.S. government was destroying perfectly good meat by the millions of tons. They also burned 2 million acres of cotton because Keynes said the destruction leads to wealth. And I'm like, if that's the answer, why doesn't Obama just call out the Air Force and carpet bomb New York City? Nobody has to get hurt. You could evacuate them all ahead of time. See, we bring them over here. I'm sure you guys wouldn't mind putting them up for a couple weeks at your place. and then we call out the Air Force and we level New York City. We turn New York City into a pile of rubble. Then every unemployed person in America could be given a job rebuilding New York City. Do you see? We could get unemployment down to 0. Everybody would have a job because it would be such a massive task to rebuild New York City. Now, the only problem is that after a certain number of years, presumably they would be done, right? At some point, they would 100% rebuild New York City, and then you'd have to lay them off because the job is done. But you know what you do then? You bomb it again. See, we could keep bombing and building and bombing and building, and we would have 100% employment forever. One more tiny little problem. This is insane. And I want to welcome you to the world of mainstream economic thought in the United States today. There are 1,600 colleges and universities in the United States. How many of them do you think they teach this in their economics department? Not as a theory, as an absolute fact. This is like global warming. It's settled. It's settled science. We don't debate it anymore. It's an absolute fact that the road to prosperity is through debt, inflation, destruction, and waste. Where do we go from here? This is so easy to prove wrong. You know, I hardly know where to start. But one of my favorite economic tests is what I call the desert island test. There's something about a desert island. The air is so crisp and clean, and the ocean breezes and the sunshine, it clears your head. If you want to try to understand a difficult economic problem, go to a desert island, and it all gets clear. So I want you guys to take an imaginary trip with me. Let's imagine that all of us in this room were on a ship and we went sailing somewhere, and let's say there was a storm and we get shipwrecked on a desert island like Robinson Crusoe. I was in Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, and they wanted it to be Gilligan's Island. So I'm gonna leave this up to you. You can be Gilligan or Robinson Crusoe, your choice. But we've got no radio. Nobody knows where we are. For all you know, we could be stuck on this island for the rest of our lives. Just imagine this with me for a minute. Would it not be immediately obvious to everybody that we better start producing? I mean, you wouldn't even have to discuss it. We better get to work and produce. We would probably very quickly discover another economic principle called the division of labor, which is very simply some people are better at some things and other people are better at other things. And we'd figure out who was good at what. We'd probably send some people into the woods to hunt for animals we could eat, don't you imagine? We'd have people catching fish, people picking berries, people building huts, mending clothes, cooking dinner. We'd figure out who was good at what, and we'd get to work, and we'd probably trade off. Don't don't you imagine if I caught a fish and you would pick some berries, we could trade off, we each have a more balanced meal. Now let's imagine that I was there and I said, well, I'm a Keynesian. So I'm not going to produce anything. But by consuming, I'm going to stimulate you to produce more. What do you think? Is that a persuasive argument? I'm going to just lie on the beach all day and get a suntan. But when dinner comes, I'm eating a double portion of it. I'm going to eat twice as much dinner as anybody else will, having contributed nothing to it. And that's really going to rev up our economy. Just imagine that. Let's imagine that you built a hut to shelter yourself from the rain, so you could sleep at night and not be exposed to the elements. And let's say I came along and I burned your hut to the ground. And I said, see, I've stimulated you. Now you can build it again. You thought you were going to be unemployed tomorrow, but I found you a job rebuilding the hut I burned down. You're welcome. I think I'm going to find myself floating out to sea, strapped to a coconut. Okay? I can't imagine anybody tolerating me on their island. But I want you to realize that Keynes, or for that matter, Barack Obama, or Nancy Pelosi, would look at this and say, no, he's the secret to your whole economy. It's his enormous appetite that's just stimulating and driving your economy. Really, do you think so? It's so obvious. If you as an individual produce more and consume less, what will happen to you over time? That's right. And if you produce less and consume more, what will happen to you over time? You will get poorer. I mean, do you need to study economics to realize this? Apparently, it helps not to study economics to realize this. And the same thing is obviously true with a society, which is just a collection, of lots of people. The math could not be more straightforward than that. We are destroying our country because we've adopted an utterly nonsensical policy that's just looking through the wrong end of the telescope and seriously thinks that producing less and consuming more is what improves the economy. I don't know what I don't know what to say to people like this. Oh, and by the way, that thing about supply and demand being out of whack, is that even true? That this is the whole premise on which his entire book is based, is about supply and demand being out of whack. And interestingly enough, we know it's not true because another economist named Jean-Baptiste Say rips Keynes's theory apart. He very clearly goes through the whole thing and demonstrates very clearly that it's utter nonsense. And yet Say never mentions Keynes by name. Do you know why not? That's right, he hadn't been born yet. Okay, but 100 years before Keynes was born, his theory had already been ripped apart by Say. I would have thought that coming up with a theory that had been destroyed 100 years before you were born would have gotten in the way of your winning the Nobel Prize, but apparently not. If you're in favor of big government, it doesn't stop you at all. And so, what does Say tell us? He says like this, he says it can look like supply and demand are out of whack. If you own a store and nobody is coming into your store and buying anything, and I were to come to you and I say, well, what do you think about the economy? What would you say? You'd say the economy stinks because no one's coming into my store. That's what's wrong with the economy. If 5 minutes later a busload of Japanese tourists pulls up and they come in and buy you to the bare walls, you say, well, now it's fine. Now the economy is great. So, from the inside out, it looks like that. But Say says you're missing the point. He says supply and demand cannot be out of whack for one very simple, important reason. They're the same thing. This is called Say's law. He says basically, supply is demand. Supply and demand cannot be out of whack because there is no difference. There are two ways of describing the exact same thing. You can't be out of whack with itself. What does that mean? Supply is demand. Well, let's take the case of the shoemaker. Why does the shoemaker make shoes? Because he really likes shoes? Shoes just make him happy and give him a warm, cozy feeling inside. When I was in Los Angeles, somebody said, he's got a shoe fetish. The shoemaker makes shoes because he wants bread. That's why he makes shoes. But he can't go to the baker and say, give me bread. He's got to have something for the baker. And by the way, you might even take a moment and ponder other possibilities. You know, the shoemaker could rob the baker. He could bring a gun and say, now you better get me the bread. He could sneak into the bakery in the middle of the night and steal the bread by stealth. We can come up with answers like that. It's worthwhile looking at them. They've got, forget the moral side of this. From a strictly economic point of view, they've got a huge problem. The shoemaker doesn't just want bread today. He wants bread tomorrow, and next week, and next month, and next year. If he keeps trying to steal the bread, it may work once, but one of these days the baker is going to be waiting for him with a shotgun. The shoemaker actually has an economic interest in making sure that the baker's got an economic interest. They actually both do better by making each other happy. Okay, the shoemaker wants the baker to continue making bread as much as possible, and so why is the baker baking bread? Because he wants the shoes. Is that not what we all do? We all produce so we can consume. Whatever it is you produce, you're producing in order to consume. And so those shoes may look like supply to you or me. To the shoemaker, those shoes are his demand. See, they're one and the same. And if the shoemaker's wife tells him, you know, this week when you go to the market, I got an extra long list for you of things we need to get back from the market, okay? What must the shoemaker now do? He's got to sell some more shoes. If he's got more things, because the shoes are his demand. If he's got more things to buy, he's got to have more shoes to sell or trade or whatever he does in return for them. Supply and demand are one and the same. This is all nonsense from beginning to end. And yet, as I said, it's been the policy of the government all these years. So what's making us poorer as a country? Fewer and fewer Americans are producing anything. By the latest Drudge Report headline, was there 92 million Americans, adult Americans, who are not even in the labor force? Well, add to that, we've got millions on unemployment who count as being in the labor force, who have been collecting unemployment insurance for years. Why do we have unemployment insurance? Who invented that? Was it because we felt compassion for poor, unemployed people and wanted to lend them a helping hand in the spirit of charity? No. Unemployment insurance was invented by John Maynard Keynes with the express purpose. He said if you pay people when they're not working, there'll be more demand and less supply, and that'll fix the economy. We're back to the same theme again of non-production and more consumption. We've got millions in government jobs producing nothing. You know, what does the Department of Energy do? You know, produce energy? They're negative producers. We have less energy because we have a Department of Energy. If they'd all go on strike, we'd all be richer. We can go on. We've got a Department of Agriculture. They don't grow crops. They pay farmers not to grow crops. Why do they do that at the Department of Agriculture? Pay farmers not to grow crops? Because Keynes said so. Okay, I loved your talk about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, but in Washington today, they're like Constitution's Monstitution. But what Keynes said in his book in the 30s, that is the law of the land. He said, pay farmers not to grow crops. We are still obeying his every command slavishly as a country right now today. Then we've got private sector jobs that only exist because of the government. See, they're not real jobs. So I'll give you an example. The IRS employs 110,000 people to make sure that you pay enough taxes and to make sure your group doesn't get tax exempt status. And so what do? You hire a tax accountant to protect yourself from the IRS agent. So here's the question, is that a real job? No, it's not. And I don't want to offend the accountants. Accountants are useful. There will always be accountants. Anyone running a business will want an accountant to keep track of the money. There's no question that that's a useful thing to do. But these particular accountants are not helping anybody run a business. They're just wrestling with a 70,000-page tax code, which doesn't need to exist. We've got the IRS agents on one side, the tax accountants on the other side, and they're wrestling through this insanely complicated tax code that nobody understands, and none of them are producing anything, are they? These are smart people. They've got graduate degrees. Okay? And we've relegated them into an utterly non-productive segment of our economy, where nothing's being produced. I can go on and on. I could talk about the college students who stay in college into their 30s. Getting graduate degrees in subjects like gay and lesbian studies, African American studies, indigenous studies. Oh, and there was another one. A guy told me his son was majoring in poverty studies. I was like, well, that's the road to a promising future, let me tell you. You want to major in poverty studies. Okay? And what's the problem with this? You know, some people are like, well, what, you don't like gay people or poor people? No, the problem is these aren't subjects. The whole point of getting educated was supposed to be that you learn how to do something useful so you can contribute to the economy. Having spent 4 years and $200,000 learning how oppressed you are, and now exactly what is it that you're competent to do? Nothing. Because we've completely forgotten the point. The point is to produce stuff. Wealth is not money. If money were wealth, do you know what the wealthiest country in the world would be? Zimbabwe, that's right. The poorest guy in Zimbabwe is a trillionaire. And jobs are not wealth. Jobs are useful if it's producing something that's useful. But you know, everybody in North Korea has a job. You think there's unemployment in North Korea? But they're dirt poor because they're not producing anything. The point of an economy is to produce stuff. Having forgotten that, we've completely undermined everything that it means to be an economy. So anyway, there's my economic thought for the day. I want to take a minute and tell you about my books, because I write books, I gotta do that. And if there's time for questions, I'm happy to answer them. Years ago, my friends told me I should write a book. And I did, and it was like the wrong book. Everybody thought I was going to write a 500-page tome about economics. But I had an epiphany that nobody reads 500-page tomes about economics. You could put that in your coffee table, the dust will be 3 inches thick before anybody touches it. If you write something that's fun and funny and accessible, you reach millions of people who are never going to read the economics book. So my first book is called The New Democrat, and it's based on The Cat in the Hat. Who has read The Cat in the Hat? Yes. Okay. Cat shows up uninvited at this middle-class American home. What does he do when he gets inside? He wrecks the place. He wrecks everything he touches. He destroys the house. And I was like, that's kind of like Obama. Yep. And what's fascinating is that the cat never gets it. To the last page of the book, the cat is insanely overconfident with like no justification at all for his confidence. He never gets what's obvious to everybody else, and that is that he is the problem. And I was like, that's Obama. It's exactly his personality. Could you imagine the man ever coming to suspect that he is the problem? In a million years, that thought would never occur to him, as obvious as it might be to everybody else. And I was like, so it was just perfect. So my book is about Obama, but based on the Cat in the Hat. And he's got these two little friends, Thing 1 and Thing 2, do you remember? They became Pelosi and Reed. And I realized I was writing the first published history of the Obama years, or at least the first one in rhyme. And it goes through everything. It goes through death panels and birth certificates and bailouts and stimuluses and Benghazi, like everything you remember from 6 fun-filled Obama years, all done as the Cat in the Hat. It's done well. I got my first book review last year. Salon.com reviewed my book, and they said that this is the most twisted piece of conservative propaganda print matter out there. I was a happy man that day. That's on the cover now. And I was moved to write my second book. Who's read the Lorax by Dr. Seuss? Okay, Dr. Seuss was a huge leftist. He was a lifelong member of the Socialist Party, not the Democrats, the Socialist Party. And he fills his children's books with socialist messages for your kids. And the Lorax was his environmentalist book. It is about an evil capitalist called the Onceler. And they made a movie out of this a year or two ago, remember? There was a movie 2 years ago. And it's about an evil capitalist called the Onceler who cuts down trees and makes consumer goods. And we learned that that's bad, bad, bad. He drives the trees to extinction. He wipes them out, they become extinct, and then his factory goes out of business because there's no more trees. And I read this to my kids. I was like, does that make sense to you? Do you think that capitalists destroy species that their business depends on? I'll put it this way. Who thinks that Colonel Sanders is going to drive the chicken to extinction? I want to know. Who's worried about that? That Colonel Sanders is going to throw every last chicken into the fryer and you will never see another chicken because they will become extinct. See, I think it's just the opposite. I think Colonel Sanders cares more about the survival of the chicken species than pretty much anybody else on Earth. He probably cares more than the chickens do. He's got millions and hundreds of millions of dollars on the line, and he's going to constantly make more chickens to keep this whole business he's got going. And I'll tell you something else. There are more chickens alive in the world today than ever before in history. Do you know why? Because we like to eat them. That's why. The greatest thing that ever happens to a species is that human beings like to eat you. This is like winning the species lottery, okay? And you could say about chickens or cows or sheep or wheat and corn. Name the species. We clear millions of acres just for you. We keep the predators away, we feed you, we keep you warm in the winter, you get sick, we call in doctors for you. What other species gets treated like this? Now, in the end, we're going to kill you and eat you. But that was going to happen anyhow. What do you think happens in the wild? Imagine you're a chicken in the wild. How does your life end? You move to Miami and buy a condo on South Beach? Okay, you're getting killed and eaten, and far more unpleasantly in the wild than on Old MacDonald's farm. So this was a book that desperately needed to be parodied. Mine is called The Gorax because it stars Al Gore as the Lorax character. And it's about how America used to be free and prosperous because we were free. And then the environmentalist wackos showed up and step by step, regulation by regulation, drove all the businesses out of business, destroyed all the jobs. Originally I was going to call it The State of California, was the original title for the book. And so by the end of my book, there are no more businesses. There are no more jobs. The only thing still functioning in the entire country when my book ends is the Federal Reserve, which keeps printing money. Everything else has stopped. And I'm going to read you the end of this because I like to end my talk on this. It's a good way to end. And I'm one of those rare authors who doesn't mind telling you how the book ends. So after all of that, here's what he says. He says, "So I took a few stones from my factory lot, and I spelled out a word that's worth more than I've got. A word that means everything to one who is lost, because freedom is worth it, whatever the cost. And now that you're here, it's all plain to see that freedom itself just isn't free. Unless people like you are willing to fight to bring back our freedoms, it'll never be right. So catch," calls the 1%ler. He lets something fall. It's the Constitution, the last copy of all. You're in charge of our heritage. Don't let us down. Teach your friends and your children. Spread it around. Stand up for your freedom against socialist schemers, environmentalist wackos, and utopian dreamers. Don't let crackpot economists and left-wing politicians get in the way of your most vital mission. If we can pry our country from these political hacks, maybe our prosperity and all will come back." So that is my second book. I brought a couple with me over here if you're interested in seeing them. And I can show you, I've got a third book coming out about Hillary. Is my new one, but that's not out yet, but it's going to be out very shortly. And so anyhow, they make cool gifts for, like conservative people, if you happen to know any. Should I take questions? Is there time for questions? Yes, sir, question.
Who was the only non-Keynesian president over the last 80 years?
You guess first.
Reagan.
Reagan, who actually studied economics. Reagan was one of the very few presidents who understood anything about economics in the last 80 years. And he was very specifically not a Keynesian. It was sadly Nixon, who was a Republican, who famously said, "We're all Keynesians now." It's a famous Nixon quote. This is, it's not even controversial. Everyone's a Keynesian now. And it was George W. Bush, whom I voted for, who said I had to put aside my free market principles to save the free market. This is nonsense. It was a huge government bailout of a private business.
I have your books, and I love your illustrator, especially when you put in little things like Winston Churchill's bust in the presidential office, which is given back.
I try to put a lot of detail because I want it to be something you could read a couple times and pick up on new stuff. So I appreciate that. Thank you. I got them right over here.
You didn't mention redistribution, and it seems like that's the way the Keynesian thing is being pushed because people like free things.
Sure. Well, I mean, obviously, if you want the whole story, you got to do the seminar. Which, by the way, if you'd like me to come back August, September, I'll do it. I'm here. You don't have to twist my arm. It is a combination of ideas here that are all bad, but we need to look at them. We need to look at them separately and how they work together. And what Keynes tries to do with redistribution is try to get money to people that he thinks are more likely to spend it. So he says, if you've got lots of money, you're not spending it, we should take it away from you and give it to someone who will spend it. Because the idea is that spending is the road to prosperity. But it's not true. It's the exact opposite. Savings is the road to prosperity. Because as you save up your assets, and this would be true if you're a single individual on a desert island like Robinson Crusoe, or if you're a single individual in a big society, or if you are indeed the whole society. The more you save, the more capital there is to invest and experiment and build better and better things going into the future. So he's exactly wrong, but he very specifically thinks that savings is bad. I mean, it's unmistakable. I mean, he's very clear on this, and so this is where we get into the huge argument. So the reason he specifically wants to redistribute is if you're not spending all your money. He says, if I give the money to this, to this crackhead over here, he'll spend it the minute he gets his hands on it. And so that's much better for the economy, if you believe this crazy theory. I know this gentleman over here had a question like a week and a half ago.
I'll ask you later, because most people don't get this question.
Okay.
Two more questions, and then we're going to move on.
Okay, we've talked ad nauseum about Keynes. What economic system would you advocate that you know of?
Well, the short word is freedom or capitalism. And when capitalism is very simple, you don't force people. If you let people do what they want to do, then there's no force. What you've got is capitalism. Okay? Capitalism is not some elaborate plan I have to explain to you. You leave people alone. And what I do in my seminar is I endeavor to explain how we get the absolute best possible results in every possible measure by not forcing people, by leaving them alone. The other term that may be useful is Austrian School economics. Okay? Yeah. Yes.
I got the idea that you were going to talk about that tonight in the preview that was given out.
Okay. Well, I talked about it backwards. I talked about the opposite of it. I gave an Austrian school analysis of Keynes. But I'm an Austrian school guy, and my seminar is about Austrian school economics. And the analysis that I gave you of Keynes tonight is an Austrian school analysis of Keynes.
Hey, Loren, we have one more question over here.
Yeah, if all this borrowing and printing money and all this stuff, sounds like it causes inflation, right? And we're doing a lot of it right now. Why is everybody freaking out and thinking, why are we all terrified of deflation right now?
Well, why are we not terrified of deflation?
Why are we terrified of deflation if all the stuff we're doing right now is inflation?
Well, yeah, well, I'm not terrified of deflation. I mean, the fact is that this is something that is very specifically controlled by governmental policy. Again, this is more directly than almost anything else is. You will never have deflation if you've got a Fed with the philosophy that our current Fed has. And I don't necessarily think that deflation's bad. Deflation may be exactly the right thing under the right set of circumstances. It's not some horrible thing. Deflation simply means that your money's worth more and prices go down. I mean, it's not like, oh, the horror, prices went down. Oh my gosh. Okay, so it's not necessarily bad, but you're not going to have it because you've got a Fed with the exact opposite philosophy from mine, and all they have to do to cure deflation is print more money. You know, why doesn't Zimbabwe suffer from deflation? You know, if you can print money limitlessly, you have perfect power to prevent deflation. I'm just not sure that preventing deflation is necessarily a good thing. If you have a sane monetary policy, by which I mean a form of money which is tamper-proof, like gold. And I don't have time to talk about the gold standard at length, but the whole point about gold is there's nothing magic about it. It just can't be tampered with, because nobody can produce more gold out of thin air. That's the only advantage to gold. You could base your economy on silver, on platinum, on aluminum, you pick anything, okay? By having something that's tamper-proof, like the gold standard, what happens to prices over time if you have something like gold as your currency? Prices will go down. Things will tend to get cheaper and cheaper over time. Why? Because the whole process of capitalism is that we learn to do things more and more efficiently, do we not? That's how that's what normally happens. We come up with new efficient ways of doing things. Prices will tend to drop over time, which encourages savings, by the way, because your money will be worth more tomorrow than it is today as prices go down, which is one of the reasons Keynes doesn't like it, because he thinks savings is bad. There's a whole philosophical thing going on here, and that's deflation, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. So it's not bad, and we won't have it anyhow the way on our current system, because the Fed will just print more money and prevent it, even though it might be a good thing.